Welcome back for our second session of this day, focused on the transboundary water governance. This afternoon, we have the great pleasure to receive our guest speaker, Jon O'Riordan. Jon O'Riordan is a former Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Sustainable Resource Management in the British Columbia provincial government. He has been involved in a lot of the planning, legal planning, the Great Bear Rainforest, and different other environmental issues and challenges. He has completed 35 years in the public service, mainly with the provincial government in environmental management, land and resource planning. And he's also a senior policy and research advisor for policy project on ecological governance. And he will speak today about the Columbia River Treaty renegotiation process. And this Columbia River Treaty renegotiation process is a huge, important legal, diplomatical, and political tool in the world. And this example could be influential, could influence a lot of other regions in the world. So it's a very important session. And before Jon, the structure of this afternoon, Oliver Brandes will introduce the session. We will watch the trailer of the movie produced by Jon O'Riordan. After this trailer and the movie, you will have a session of discussion. You could prepare your question during the movie or during the trailer. And the second part of this afternoon will focus on the Columbia River Treaty renegotiation, review, and update. Oliver, I give you the floor.
Thank you, Ben. As always, very fine job of bringing us into the afternoon. My job right now, as we're building a little bit on our earlier conversation from the first 3 hours, where we got a sense of what is watershed governance, what are the concepts behind governance, how we make these collective decisions, but importantly, some of these very specific examples. Arguably, what I'm going to do now, I could have done then, but I felt it was a better way to immerse yourself in some reality. And now I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro into some of the architecture, the larger structure within which these international agreements operate. And I'm going to start by saying, let's remember who I am. I am not an international law expert. What I am is I spend time on water governance, on watershed security, and I spend a lot of time on Canadian water law. By extension, I take some of this. So I'm going to share some information by way of overview. So we're not going to critique the specific detail. That's for you to kind of explore on your own time. But I think it's important to understand these larger architecture, so that when you think about, okay, how does something like the IJC and the Boundary Waters Agreement fit in? How does the Columbia River Treaty that Jon's going to talk about fit in? And I'm going to start by saying water is the most important global resource that only very recently has any international agreement. It's a pretty remarkable turn of events, right? 1997, UN Convention on the Law of Non-Navigable Uses of International Watercourses, UNWC, or just for simplicity, Watercourses Convention. It came into force as of August 17th, 2014. 2014, usually when I talk about history dates, people can't remember those dates because it's well before they were born or whatever. 2014 is, yesterday by international law kind of standards. And it kind of came into force. The 35th ratifying signature was Vietnam. Canada also voted for the 1997 convention, but is not a signatory. And it's because of the way that we operate with the US. We basically have one transboundary neighbor, and the Boundary Waters Treaty is our arrangement. This is the international piece. So this convention is the most authoritative source of international water law. We're going to talk just briefly about international law, remembering I am not an international law lawyer, but I do know some of the concerns and critiques. This convention provides the global legal framework and the international consensus on transboundary water. It is principle driven rather than results driven. So it gives us a framework within which to operate. And if you mapped the 1909, now let's think of those dates, 1909 Canadian-US agreement, it has many of the same parallels. So you can see how Canada-US relations often kind of leads us in a way. And that's, I'm giving you a little early sell, Jon, because the work of the Columbia will lead many places in the world because, and when we're talking about international law, it often has these kind of timelines, hopefully not 100 years, but it does a couple of things. It codifies existing international law as it pertains to transboundary waters and the joint management of rivers that flow across international borders. So that's really important. It specifically brings together existing legal principles and regulations in place throughout many river basins all over the world. So it kind of begins to kind of bring us together to a kind of a common understanding. I just want to give a little couple lightning facts. If I had more time, you'd get some slides, but you're going to be dizzy with slides anyways. Transboundary waters is important, right? 276 international watercourses contain water supplies that affect 148, almost 150 countries. So most countries actually have to worry about it. They cover half the Earth's surface and are home to around 40% of the world's population. 40% of the people live in a transboundary watershed. 40%. That's a lot of people, just if we're wondering. I can throw out a few simple facts, right? Every African state is said to share freshwater with at least one other country. You have a number like the Danube, the Rhine, the Congo, the Nile, the Niger, the Zambezi, all pass through 9 or more countries. Talk about having to collaborate, right? Transboundary rivers contain 60% of the world's river flows. So over half of all the water is flowing through these systems. Cooperative management frameworks exist, however, for only about 40% of these cases, sometimes less than half. So we're not seeing this. It's important, a couple things. So this UN convention did not lay down hard and fast rules for sharing water, but it was a statement of principles that nations should ensure the sustainable and equitable use of shared rivers. The negotiations started, and now we can think a bit about history, in the 70s. So probably before some folks were born, they started thinking about it. So it takes some time to do international law, some patience. It's important here because now we talk politics for a moment, political economy. Only 3 countries voted against. I won't list them yet, but I'm going to tell you they have one thing in common. They are upstream countries on major rivers. Water and gravity matter because if I'm upstream, I have a lot of power over my neighbor because I can do stuff and they can't do anything about it because they're going to get it. And that's what Meryl Ann really importantly said. The reason Canada and US works is because there's lots of things that do this. They go back and forth or they're shared. So the 3 countries, I could test you guys, but China, Turkey, and Burundi, all major upstream countries on major rivers. They did not like it. I'll give you lots of facts about them. Let's just remember, what I call my international law 101, right? International law is horizontal. It's not vertical like domestic power where there's hierarchy. It's vertical. Authority is above those who must obey. So you have international law, but you got to agree and you got to play. There's no supreme lawmaking, as much as we all wish. We know maybe Ben Perrier maybe is our supreme lawmaker, but otherwise there is no supreme lawmaking or law enforcing authority. States create the law and can choose whether or not to obey. This is important. I know it's obvious for some of you, but it's important to recognize that. There's lots to be said about who's a legal personality in this international arena, but I like to think of it, and it's commonly said, this billiard ball approach, where these states sort of fly around the billiard ball table and they can hit each other and they can make arrangements. Of course, it gets much more nuanced now when we start talking about how these billiard balls begin to merge and they become much more integrated. I'm just going to spend 5 more minutes, less than that, on some of the key elements of this Watercourses Convention and say that it really is meant to address 3 kinds of situations. 3. 1, where there's no treaty between the 2 riparian or sharing countries. They have no arrangement. Then it would apply. Where not all co-riparians are parties to an existing agreement. So one of those scenarios, we got 9 people sharing a river and only 7 maybe have agreements between them, well, then the others would come into the net. And where watercourses is subject to an existing agreement, but that agreement doesn't cover all the elements of the ratified convention. So you can see these really important elements. And now I want you to look for a moment. I assume you can look at the screen there to look at what I call the theories of allocation. On the top left, we have absolute territorial integrity, no interference with natural flow and conditions. So that's the idea that I'm in a country and you can't fiddle with my water, even if you're upstream. That's on one end of the spectrum. Absolute territorial sovereignty, it means unlimited use within natural boundaries, regardless of the need of downstream states. So one favors the downstream player. I have a right to get the water as it left your country. And the other one favors the upstream state because I get to do whatever I want and you get what's left. Now, these, of course, are not the standard. These are not what are used. These are often bargaining positions. And in fact, our friends in America have used and argued for both principles at the same time. Absolute territorial sovereignty, the so-called Harmon Doctrine, which was a dispute between USA and Mexico on the Rio Grande, 1895. They basically said, we want absolute territorial sovereignty. We do whatever we want and you get it. But then when it came time to mess with the Canadians, they wanted absolute territorial integrity. They were worried about the Canadians and their messy Trail smelter case. Canadians are very bad polluters, by the way, 1938. So you can see this tension. I don't want to dwell on this. We can do lots of international law and talk about it. But what the convention does is basically codify this customary international law, this idea of limited territorial sovereignty. State must respect other states and have an equal right to use. And then there's lots of fiddling and lots of language that we can talk about, like only lawyers love to talk about. What does that equal? What is equal? Equal is not the same in all cases. It's different responsibilities. There's lots of components. And I'm going to draw your eye towards where are we headed? A communities of interest approach. And we're going to see some elements of that in some of the Columbia River Treaty piece, where we begin to see states manage a river as a single unit, an ecological unit, not just an ecological unit. Remember this morning, and a socio-ecological unit. And territorial boundaries become less relevant. I know that's hard news for a whole course on borders, but territorial boundaries become less relevant. Strong cooperation becomes really critical. And with that, maybe I will pause for a second. I'm just going to say, we could spend some time, but we won't do it right now. There's a bunch of different parts to the UN Convention, and it basically does 5 main goals to help us manage international transboundary. How do we behave with each other? Remember when I opened the session, I talked a bit about how law is not just a set of rules. Yes, that's easy. It's also about how we live together. How do we work together? How do we interact in this sort of larger sense, right? And so the 5 things that the convention does, it creates mechanisms for providing information. That was a theme that you guys brought out in your feedback. It's a way to deal with conflict. It's about rules and this equitable property rights, inducing this rule compliance so we know who has what responsibility, what does it mean to be equal, provides infrastructure or the necessary tools to manage the resource. So let's say I do have a dam, but I still have a responsibility to ensure the right amount of flow. So downstream, there's fisheries and access to drinking water. And so we have these mechanisms that we begin to operate together. And then it gets more interesting when we start talking about being prepared for change, this level of adaptability. That is what this convention does. There is, we could do a whole course just on this convention alone, but we're seeing a evolution before our very eyes.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to present some of my ideas on the Columbia Basin Treaty, and I think it follows very closely to what Oliver has just outlined in terms of the UN Convention and the requirement for Canada and US to collaborate on the Columbia. I'm starting my presentation with a map of the Columbia to give you a sense of its geography. So you'll notice that the border between Canada and the US is at the top end of the Columbia River. So 15% of the Columbia Basin is in Canada, 85% geographically is in the States. And just to give you a sense of size, the total size of the Columbia Basin is roughly the size of France. So it's a large geographical area. But the flows are unequal. So in flooding situations, the flows from Canada represent 50% of the total flows, even though we only have 15% of the geographical area. And that's a big factor when it comes to managing the basin. But what I really wanted to talk about is the natural history of the Columbia prior to the treaty. So from time immemorial to 1930, the Columbia was a natural system. So none of the dots, the yellow dots, the red dots, which are all dams, were in the Columbia prior to 1930. It was a natural system. And some of the features of the natural system, well, the principal one was fisheries, the Pacific salmon, wild salmon. So the Columbia Basin in 1930 was the fourth largest salmon producer in North America. 20 million fish entered the Columbia every year and went up the Columbia and then went all the way to the top of the Columbia and down to beyond Mica on your map and down the arm to a place called Canal Flats. So the fish migrated 2,000 kilometers from the mouth of Columbia near Portland to the Rocky Mountains in Canada, and of course in several of the tributaries. And that fish was the mainstay of the indigenous population. So prior to about 1850, very little of the Canadian and not much of the American Columbia was settled. Indigenous people relied on salmon as their major food source, ceremonial source and spiritual source. And they still have many ceremonies today recognizing the importance of wild salmon to their culture. The following settlement, the Columbia had natural attributes in terms of agriculture. So it was a market garden of Western Canada, lots of fruits and vegetables, moved down by raft on the Columbia down through the lakes, and a major forestry industry, particularly in the lower zones closer to the existing Columbia and the lakes, where trees were easily accessible and provided large resource base for the growing settlements. So the Columbia prior to 1930 was a preeminently varied and vital natural resource. But it all changed in 1930 with the development of the New Deal following the Roosevelt administration. And they, through the New Deal, started to build dams on the Columbia River. Not in Canada, only on the Columbia River. So the red dams that are identified on that map were sequentially built from 1934 to 1946. So during the war, to provide electrical power, hydroelectric power for the development industry created by the war years. But the biggest dam was the Grand Coulee Dam, which is on the Columbia just south of the Canadian border. And you'll see it as a yellow dot. And that blocked the fish coming up the Columbia. So when the Chief Joseph and the Grand Coulee dams were built in the mid-1930s, 20 million fish that were migrating throughout the Columbia and providing a rich heritage to the indigenous population was choked off. And since that date, no fish have entered into the Canadian Columbia, other than on the western side in a tributary called the Okanagan. So a huge natural heritage was lost literally overnight. And most of what we've been discussing, particularly with Maryland Fair, about the engagement of Indigenous nations in governance of their water did not exist at all in 1930. So the two dams were built in the mid-30s with zero consultation and engagement with First Nations. The very first thing they knew was when the fish didn't come back. So what I now want to do is briefly present the trailer for the Changing Course. This is a documentary that I produced with a number of colleagues with some financial support from the provincial government. But it was really designed not just to talk about the Columbia, it was designed to talk about the importance of combining nature with water. And that when there's a disconnect between nature and water, we run into serious trouble. And so the film is called Changing Course. What we were trying to do in this film is to argue and support the need to change the course we've had over the last 60 years, 70 years, to reconnect the Columbia with nature. And this is a universal commentary, not just for the Columbia, it's for many of the international rivers around the world that have lost contact with nature. So I'm going to briefly show you the trailer.
Columbia River is a very important part of our culture, our being. That big water is so important.
The issue with the way it's structured in terms of governance is really not so much about the water, it's about what the water produces, which is revenue, money. And if money becomes the issue, then you're not going to do what's right for the water or for the people or for the fish.
Enough is enough. We've had enough negative, enough impacts to the environment.
There's no question that climate change has already begun to impact the Columbia Basin.
That's what we're trying to do in the Columbia Basin, is to collect the data sets to do a water balance approach for subsequent water budgets that will be required by communities in allocating water.
Canada and the United States, we're neighbors. No getting away from that, and we have to work together in order to protect the environment.
The fact is that unless we change our approach of having the human being as the all-powerful, that we're going to continue to get ourselves into trouble.
Each of us is a natural system, and I began to realize that the freedom of the water was no longer in many circumstances, and that of course reverberated out to the lack of freedom for the fish, the lack of freedom for the ungulates, the lack of freedom for the trees, the sedges, for anything that was living in the ecological culture that had evolved because of the free running water. And that was why I think I wanted to fully understand why a culture would have taken all of that away.
So if you haven't had a chance to see the full film, I believe you have access to it. I would certainly encourage you to see the entire film. It takes about 60 minutes to view. Yeah, and so the film is basically a series of stories told by Indigenous leaders and community leaders of a non-Indigenous background, giving their side of the story to the Columbia Treaty and the value of the Columbia. And the collective wisdom of these people, there were roughly 26 people who were interviewed, presents the history of the treaty, the current status of the treaty, and the aspirations of most of these 26 people about what they want to see in the Columbia with the treaty being renegotiated. So as I say, it's the call was for changing course and to reconnect the river with nature. And I'm going to try to explain in the next 40 minutes how that new future is now a reality as against something that was aspirational a few years ago. So let me outline what I'm going to do in the next 40 minutes. I'm going to talk about the genesis of the treaty, what caused it to be developed, what are the key provisions of the treaty that was signed back in 1964. Some of the changes now agreed to in principle that were released about 2 weeks ago after a series of negotiations over the last 5 or 6 years between Canada and the US. The importance of UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, in the negotiations, and the evolved role of First Nations in the treaty, which I think parallels a lot of what Marilyn Fair was talking about this morning and all of us. And then we've got 3 discussion topics that I want to give you some background on, to give you some facts and figures to help you with your discussion. And then I'll talk about where we go next with the treaty. I should say, from a personal note, the treaty was signed in September 1964, and I arrived in Canada in September 1964 from Scotland, where I did my university undergraduate education. So I have a longevity in Canada of the same as the current treaty. But I also changed course when I came to Canada. Let me just go show you this film, and then I'll go back. In the period of the 1930s to 1948, the US effectively dammed the entire lower portion of the Columbia. So everything from the mouth of the Columbia at Portland right to the Canadian border was a series of dams, and you can see that in this slide. And so the main point, these dams had 2 principal functions. One was to provide hydropower for the growing industrial base, partially driven by the Second World War, and then by the gradual growth of population following the war. And secondly, provided flood control for the floodplains of the Columbia in the States. But in 1948, there was 0 storage in Canada. So Canada was a free-flowing river in 1948. But in that time, in the year 1948, there was a major flood. And because half of the water generated from Canada was unregulated, it literally overtopped the dams in the States and caused a huge amount of damage and some loss of human life. So it was a seminal event in the States, and they suddenly realized that there was no way that they could prevent future flooding without coming to an agreement with Canada on flood control and reservoir development to regulate the flows in Canada and make it more of an international agreement than was the case before. And so there was an agreement in principle in the 1950s to set up a Columbia Treaty and develop a series of dams in Canada. And I want to emphasize what Marilyn was talking about. There was a reference by the US and Canada to the IJC in 1948-49 to do the technical analysis to work out the optimum configuration of storages in Canada for developing a treaty. And without going into a lot of detail, there's many books written about this. There were multiple scenarios of dams played with the engineers and the hydrologists and the fisheries people until they came up with a final configuration of 3 dams in Canada and 1 in the States that flowed into Canada. So this was a highly evolved technical analysis by competent engineers. Very little concern about ecology, 0 concern about fisheries, because by that time, remember, the fish had been blocked from Canada. So we were dealing with a fisheries desert in Canada at the time. So the focus was on flood control and power. In So I'll go back to this. So the three dams that were built in Canada, one was the Mica Dam, which is a major power source north of the city of Revelstoke. One was called the Keenlyside Dam at the south end of the Yarrow Lakes, which is also a small power dam, but largely a storage regulator, so that the flows in the Columbia were regulated as he came into the US. And one on the Duncan, which is on the Kootenay River system, and controlled the storages coming through Kootenay Lake to the junction at Keenlyside and down into the States. So storages on the two major systems, the Columbia system and the Kootenay system. And then there was also an agreement that there would be a dam in the Libby, which is a red dam just south of the border, which flowed back in the reservoir, which flowed back into Canada by about 60 kilometers. So you had 4 storages in Canada. Since that time, Canada built the Revelstoke Dam, which is a run-of-the-river dam, to take advantage of the regulation upstream and increase the power capacity for BC. So at this stage, the Columbia system provides 50% of BC's total electrical power. Most of the other 50% comes from the Peace River. So we have what we call a 2-river system in BC, where hydropower is concentrated in 2 rivers, which means that all of the other rivers, major rivers such as the Fraser, are power free. There's no major storages on the Fraser. In fact, there's now legislation that prevents any storages on the Fraser and most of the other major systems in BC. So we focused all of our hydro on 2 river systems. The treaty was signed in 1961 at the technical level, and then it went to ratification in the US Congress and the Canadian government, and that process was completed in 1964. The treaty continues indefinitely. There's no termination date built into the treaty. What there was that after 60 years, now 2024, which is issue, there was an agreement to review the flood control portion of the treaty, because the Americans negotiated that they would pay the Canada $64 million for flood control for 60 years. And that $64 million was roughly the cost of building the 3 Canadian dams. So the Canada and BC wanted the US to pay for the dams. So they paid the capital costs of the 3 dams, which in round figures was $60 million. So they did that through this flood control agreement. But that agreement ends in 2024, and going forward, as what we'll talk about in the second half of the presentation, the US would have to pay for flood control after 2024. And that was the main trigger for renegotiating the treaty in 2014. So although the treaty continues indefinitely, there was a clause that said that if either party wanted to terminate the treaty following 2014, they could give 10 years notice to the other party that they would intend to either terminate or renegotiate. And that 10 years, a sliding scale. So if they didn't do it in 2014, decided they wanted to terminate the treaty in 2024, it would be terminated in 2034. So there's an ongoing 10-year notice built into the treaty. But because of the flood control agreement, there was an agreement with the US that starting in 2014, they would renegotiate a modernized treaty to deal with some of the weak points and changes that have taken place in the Columbia over the 50 years, 1964 to 2014. And prior to September 24, 2024, would present to Congress and to the federal government an agreement in principle for treaty amendments. And that they just got under the wire. So that Agreement in principle was completed in July the 11th this year, July the 11th, 2024, and is now entering the ratification process. The outline of the treaty is on the right-hand side of the map here. So the three dams in Canada, Duncan Dam, which is a storage-only dam, no power. The Keenlyside Dam on the Arrow Lake, which is largely storage but some power. And the Mica Dam, which was built in 1973, is almost all power and very little storage. The total amount of storage is 15.5 million acre feet. So an acre foot is a foot of water on an acre of land. It's a lot of water. In addition, the two major utilities, BC Hydro, which is the hydropower utility in British Columbia, and the Bonneville Power Authority, which is the main utility in the States, negotiated an additional 5 million acre feet of storage on Mica, which is outside the treaty and is a commercial agreement between the two power utilities. The Libby Dam is the only dam where the water the reservoir crosses the border, so it impacts on both Canada and US. And that was still a bone of contention. We'll come back to that in the agreement in principle, but it provided for some additional flood control and power. So these are the four dams: the Duncan Dam, the Arrow Dam, the Mica Dam, and the Libby Dam. The major treaty provisions are that because of this regulation in Canada, the efficiency of the hydro projects in the States greatly increased because Canada, through an agreement, through the treaty, could manage the flows so they optimally cross the border to increase power production in the States. And the additional power that was created is split. Half of it is kept by the States, half of it is returned to Canada. And I actually mean returned to Canada. In other words, the additional power is actually sent to a transmission station on the Canadian-US border in Canada. And then Canada, through its commercial arm, PowerX, through BC Hydro's commercial arm, resells that power back to the States and makes, in round figures, $200 million a year, depending on the market value of the power. So and that's called the Canadian entitlement. You'll hear that term a lot. So every year, Canada gets roughly $150 to $200 million a year by selling that power back into the States. Actually, for the first half of the treaty, 1964 to 1994, instead of paying an annual fee, the money was accumulated, and Canada accessed that money in 1994 for $254 million, and they used that $254 million to create the Columbia Basin Trust, which is a governance model, quite an innovative governance model. I'll come back to that in a later slide, which was to compensate for the impacts of the regulated dams in Canada on the environment and on communities. So it was a way of offsetting the social and environmental impacts of the dams in Canada. On the flood control side, as I mentioned, the US paid Canada $64 million up front for 60 years. That was a hell of a good bargain. I mean, on the one side, it paid the capital costs of the 3 Canadian storages. But on the other, in 1 year alone, 2014, which was a flood year, it's estimated that the benefits to the States in that year alone was over $1 billion in flood control because the US had fully developed their floodplain. on the basis that they removed the flood risk. There was a very near thing. The amount of flooding that came through that year was very close to breaking the regulatory arrangements that we have. But the dams held, and the US saved $1 billion worth of dollars. The other issue is that over time, the Canadian entitlement has become more controversial. The 50% of the increased power returned to Canada is locked into the agreement. So what it means is that whether or not the US uses the power, it's deemed to be used by the treaty. So as soon as water crosses the border, it's assumed that it has a power benefit, whether the states use it or not. And so the states are required in the treaty to pay Canada a lot more than they are actually using in power. That other water that's being used is being used largely to sustain fish flows and to some extent for irrigation. And the reason why it's sustaining fish flows is because even though the Grand Coulee and the Chief Joseph dams choked off fish to Canada, there are Pacific salmon in the States, in the Columbia system. Most of them, almost all of them, are hatchery bred, but there's 5 to 6 million fish a year returned in States. 0 in Canada, but 5 to 6 in States. Actually, not 0 in Canada because the Okanagan system, which is to the west side of the Columbia River, has free access to the Columbia. So wild salmon do come up the Columbia and enter the Okanagan system. There's about 500,000 fish there right now. And so the Americans were concerned about the fish. They established through their species at risk legislation that the Pacific salmon are protected under that legislation. And the utilities are required to provide significant financial aid to hatcheries in the States and one in Canada, in the Okanagan, to maintain hatchery-led fish. So probably 1 million wild fish and 5 million hatchery fish are in the American and Okanagan systems today. Fraction of the value that was there in 1930. But the other change has been is that the Indigenous people on both sides of the border have banded together to create what's called the Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Program. This was established in around 2000. And its purpose is to try and bring salmon back into Canada in the into the Columbia. It's going to be very tricky because to do so means that the fish have to be airlifted over the dam, over the Grand Coulee Dam, put into the Columbia River reservoir called the Roosevelt Reservoir, then flow into Canada. And when they flow into Canada, they immediately abut into the Arrow Lakes Dam at Keenly side and a series of smaller dams on the Kootenay River. So the opportunities for reintroducing salmon into the mainstream Columbia are particularly challenging, but it attests to the emotional and economic value that wild salmon have for the Indigenous populations that they have pushed for reintroduction anyway. And they're bound and determined, as you'll see when you see the full 1-hour documentary. A number of the Indigenous people speak to the emotional ties they have to salmon and their commitment over 7 generations to get these salmon back. And in their mind, they see the dams as temporary. They see salmon as permanent. And at some stage, the dams will be gone. and salmon will come back to the Columbia. So they don't see salmon coming back to Columbia in 2034, 2044. They see salmon coming back into the Columbia in 2144. That's the time frame that they're looking at. It's a completely different orientation than the so-called settlement group. The Columbia Basin Trust, as I mentioned, I'll ask Oliver for a minute, but is there, in your knowledge, any other institution similar to the Basin Trust, or is that actually a unique feature?
I'm going to say pretty unique. I can't say for sure, but the idea of something attached to a treaty like that, I don't believe exists elsewhere.
So the Columbia Basin Trust applies only in the Canadian portion of the Columbia. Doesn't apply in the States. It was created in 1994 with a one-time payment, I mentioned, from the Canadian entitlement of roughly $250 million. It endowed the money into creating this trust. The trust is effectively a bank, and it uses the money, and it gets about $50 million a year of revenue from the trust and from the revenues from a number of smaller hydro projects that were built under the trust's money. Very small dams. And that money is used for a whole range of community purposes in the Canadian Columbia. It's not just reparation for lost fish and wildlife, it's for internet prevention, housing, poverty reduction, drug management. It's for a whole array of social issues. And I think it's fair to say that the communities in the Canadian Columbia are better endowed with money from the trust than any other communities I know of in BC. It's very significant bank revenue to help deal with carbon, climate, and social infrastructure, community infrastructure. The weakness of the trust is that there are three predominant First Nations in Canada, the Silks in Okanagan in the western side of the Columbia, the Shwepnik in the northern part of the Columbia, and the Kanaha in the eastern part of the Columbia. And only one of them, the Kanaha, is represented on the board of trustees for the trust, because trust primarily deals with the main stem Columbia. And that's a bone of contention for the other two First Nations. The priorities for how the money is spent goes to a major public engagement process for all the communities and First Nations in the Columbia. And over 5 years, they thoroughly review what's been done in the past, what's been required in the future, and reset the requirements for the next 5 years. So it's a very democratic, egalitarian model, and has helped over the years to mitigate the impacts of the reservoir storages. I want to talk a little bit about mandates for the, but before I do, and I think it's important to get a bit of a picture. You need to see the film, but the issues created by the three dams in BC is that they are highly regulated. So they're very large storages. The Mica Dam covers 300 kilometers from one part of it to the other. So they have a range of 40 meters in elevation over the year because of the need for storage and power generation. So in the wintertime, there's hectares of exposed land with tree stumps, because most of the land was not properly cleared. There's zero fish values because the riparian systems are trashed. There's a loss of major agriculture. The most important agricultural lands in the Canadian Columbia are now underwater. They were thriving market gardens with vegetables and tree crops, all gone. Most of the large-scale forestry values were on the riparian zones. They're gone. And so there were significant ecological damage as a result of these three storages across the Columbia. Plus, of course, I mentioned the pre-treaty dams in the States removed all the fish. So I can't explain graphically other than through the film the collective impact of that. And I do need to say that the process for making the decision in '64 was shockingly colonial. I use it to the term colonial on steroids. There was zero consultation with either the settlers or the indigenous people. Most of the people, the first they realized that there was going to be a change in their livelihood was when a BC Hydro surveyor came onto the land and put a stake in the ground and said, this will be where the elevation is. So farms were either completely eliminated or cut in half. And there was no way that they could protest. There were no public consultation sessions to try and argue about that. There was almost zero consultation. You'll see in the film that houses that were below the waterline were burnt, they were torched in order to remove them. Graveyards were desecrated and inundated. Whole community roads were lost. The whole social fabric of the Canadian Columbia was rent asunder as a result of these dams. And it was done, I hate to say this, by white men. There was zero women involved in the discussions that I can see. It was a classic case of industrial might taking over. And there's been a lot of bitterness in the Columbia for 60 years as a result of that. And even the largesse of the Columbia Basin Trust and the $50 million a year it's been pouring into the Columbia for the last 20 years, almost 30 years, has not done enough to mitigate this. So the need to change course is dramatic, powerful, and compelling. And the status quo was completely unacceptable to the Canadian side. The entities, when they engaged in 2014 to start looking at a revised, came up with a number of principles. One is that benefits are shared, and I think Oliver mentioned in his diagram at the end about upstream and downstream rights, and in some cases upstream rights trump downstream rights, and in other cases the entities agree to work with each other and share rights. In the Columbia, there was agreement from the word go that the benefits would be shared. So there was none of this upstream Canadian, we own the water, we'll tell you what you get. That was based on the shared values. And that's still the case. Although arguably it's a bit frayed, but we'll come to that. There was, because of this history of ecological damage, particularly in Canada, to some extent in the States, there was, and of course, the changing values that we have in 2024 compared to 1964. Ecosystem health was a major factor and has now become an equal value to flood control power. So the new treaty had to rebalance ecosystem values with the commercial interests of flood control and power. As I mentioned, in 2024, because the American upfront costs had expired now, any flood control created by the Canadian storage has to be paid for by the Americans. So it's called called on. So the Americans call on Canada to control the floods in a flood year. They have to pay for that service, and that had to be negotiated. And the other principle was that any other benefits that Canada and the Americans get because of the Canadian storages need to be paid for going forward. So fish flows to protect fish in an increasingly changed climate environment down in the States. recreational values in terms of reservoir management, navigation, because the Columbia up to the Bonneville Power and the lower Columbia is a major navigation system. And of course, irrigation from the Columbia dams has opened up a large area in the States to irrigated crops, particularly apples and stone fruits. So there was a shift in the system toward ecosystem values and the US paying for the range of services that it produced.
Guys, if you have any comments, if you have any remarks or observations or thoughts or questions, the chat is yours, and you could raise your hand, and we are here to receive your powers. If you want to share anything with us, Kalpana, you have the floor.
I found the point that you made earlier very interesting, that the indigenous people see the dams as temporary. Could you elaborate a little more on that? What does that vision entail? Does it mean literally getting rid of the dams according to their envisioning?
So I missed you about the communities and the dams.
Yeah, indigenous communities.
Yeah.
Like you said that they kind of see the dams as temporary,
Yeah.
right? So what does that vision entail? What does that mean in reality when they say that these dams are temporary? Does it mean it'll not exist in the future?
Well, every dam, every engineering structure has some kind of a life cycle. And as we speak right now, 3 dams in the US, not in Canada yet, on the one of the tributaries to the American Columbia, of silting up, and their economic value has degenerated. And there's a strong push to remove them because it would open up 100 kilometers of spawning habitat for Pacific salmon. So, and there's already been 2 dams removed elsewhere in the US system. So the concept of removing dams, albeit at a relatively small scale dams, is real. It's actually happened, and it's probably going to happen again. These are big structures, the 3 dams, and their lifespan is 100 years roughly. So they were created in roughly late 60s, early 70s. So the indigenous people think that rather than restoring the dam values, in their mind, they either have to be rebuilt so that they permit fish passage, or they have to be removed. And so they have such a strong emotional drive. And when you see, I don't know if you've seen the documentary, but when you see the documentary, they have these annual ceremonies where they welcome the salmon home. And you'll see one of the ceremonies in a place called Okanagan Falls on the Okanagan system. And you can see the emotional link that it drives generations. So you've got the elders, grandmothers and grandfathers who are in their 80s, and children who are 6 or 7, and every age group in between celebrating salmon as a family and a community. They're simply not going to give up on salmon coming back. I don't believe that the dams will be removed, but it is possible that new techniques will be looked at to somehow or other get fish either through the dam or over the dam so that they can survive. And that is part of the salmon reintroduction program, is looking at innovative techniques that will actually allow fish. And there are now some fish, by the way, that were trucked around the Grand Coulee Dam, put into the Roosevelt Reservoir, swam up the reservoir, across the border, and are now spawning below the Keeneside Dam. So there are real fish that have been transported across into the Columbia. The question is, can that be done at scale? And the salmon reintroduction program, which is now being funded through the new treaty, will provide sufficient funds to look at technological opportunities to create that new future.
Maybe I just would add two quick thoughts. I think this idea of a future landscape that is not, I don't think it says binary as with dam, without dam. It's like a new future landscape. We don't know what that looks like yet. And I think the important piece there is remember what happens when you build a dam. You build a dam, you create a big pool, and you change the flow downstream. If we took away the dam, all the settlements that have now over 50 years, so you can't just, big dams anyways, you can't just take away, but you can rewild some of the terminology, you can re-engineer, you can restore riverscapes in a very different way. And that is, this is part of, I think, this generation's challenge. That's the next engineering marvel. It won't be building big things.
I was thinking about that it changes the landscape once you put a dam in place, right? So what does removing that look like? Because then there might be a great deal of challenges around restoring the river's course in a way that actually fosters this vision of, because it's not just salmon habitat restoration or bringing them back home once the landscape is already being messed up with some of the dam. It's also like coming from where I come from, like the river and the massive scale of river, and there's a dam that has been put in place. So if I'm to think about it, because those dams are already outdated now, and there's no talk about restoring them or even removing them, or how are they going to restore the river course if we are to remove those outdated dams, because they've been no use anyways. They've always triggered more flood, more problems for the larger ecology around. So yeah, thank you very much for your response.
But I just wanted to appreciate your question, because not just salmon. When you see the film, you'll see that there are literally thousands of hectares of land exposed around the reservoir, which has got zero value. They're just simply mudflats. In the summertime, there are potentially airborne pollutants because there's sand that blows in the air, and you can get actually dust storms from that. But they've got zero ecological value at this point in time. And part of the what I'm coming to is, to what extent can we change the regulation of the river? So instead of operating over a 40-meter range, they operate more like 20 meters. In other words, under the normal range of variation, they become more like lakes than reservoirs. And the riparian zones are therefore stabilized, they revegetate, and they retain ecological values, not only for nature, but also potentially for agriculture and for forestry. So part of the, and that applies differentially to some dams have, like the Mica Dam is a very difficult dam to regulate because it's got so much power that if you change the operation by 10 meters, you would lose, I'm being hypothetical here, $500 million worth of power. But if you change the Arrow Lakes reservoir by 10 meters, you lose less than $1 billion worth of power. You lose a very small amount of power. So the comparative value of ecosystem health varies between the reservoirs, but it's real. It's got value, and you'll see in the negotiations there's an attempt to rebalance that. Remember, the film's called Changing Course, Reconnecting the River with Nature. So, I mean, and that's my passion as a film director. I wanted to demonstrate the Columbia. This could be the Niger, or it could be the Nile, it could be any river that's lost contact with nature. We have a river that's got no longer ecologically healthy. It's got major problems, and I think we've got an opportunity to redress that. Anyway, thanks for your question. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Kalpana. Thank you, John. We have Vijaya. Vijaya, you have the floor for your question for John, please, or for the Audience.
Thank you, sir. I'm from India. So basically, your lecture is so informative, and it has, if I'm not mistaken, it has dealt with all the advantages of having uh, the treaty. But what I found is, like, if we look at the disadvantages, for example, huge dams creating, like, they will change the course of the rivers, and later on they may lead to natural disasters. Like, for example, in India also we have large dams on which we depend for hydroelectricity. And for example, there is Tehri Dam on the tributary of river Ganga, which is the largest river in India, which has caused these landslides, then earthquakes and all. So, how to deal with these challenges? Because the way we are having development projects, they are leading to these kind of natural disasters, and how to mitigate this, because the developed countries have the infrastructure to deal with this, but then what about the developing countries? These are my questions. Thank you.
Well, I can't speak to your examples. The dams that we have in the Columbia are on largely built in rocky, stable areas. So there's very little example of landslides and hazards and siltation. They're built in rocky basins with very stable states. The only areas of is where the tributary rivers come into the river, and they into the reservoirs, and they create delta-like areas. But there's no, I'm not aware of natural hazards being a concern in these dams. They're very well built and stable.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijaya, for sharing your
May I
thoughts,
respond
comments.
a little bit to Vijaya?
Yeah.
I think the thing that you're talking about earlier is what resonates with this case. You know, it's a conflict essentially between the kind of ecological setup that we have and the development paradigm that we have adopted. So pretty much in India, and that transfers into Nepal as well, hydropower has become an obsession, and dams are becoming sort of obsession and an essential example of development. So I think it's a conflict over there, and it's the wrong conceptualization. And the dam that I was talking about back home, it's actually India-Nepal border. The dam actually it's a transboundary dam that we have, and it was damaged way before it was predicted because of this essential sort of lack of proper understanding of the geography itself and what is going to work for us. So it's not like, you know, this well-studied thing where you know that silting will not be a very big problem. You know, it won't span a disaster, at least pretty immediately in the future. But that's not been the case with our part of the world. It's been really bad with dams. And it's a continued convenient sort of resort that the nations have taken to. So I think there's a sprawling construction of dikes and dams everywhere in India. And of course, wherever we're bordering, it's dikes and dams. And they think that's an effective strategy for flood control. Because most of these areas are floodplains, Ganga, Koshi, all these are floodplains. So instead of managing the floodplains, what they've done is like resurrected dams and dikes over and over. That's been.
And just so you don't feel uncomfortable, that's not unique, because even BC, who have spent Site C was an example with a massive amount of investment in research and understanding. And despite these risks, chose to go ahead. So yes, I think the point is we are still in a high development paradigm. And that is not our job to tell you where we're at. We all know where we're at. We're trying to give you a sense of where things might be changing May not be our lifetimes, but will be eventual.
Well, I'm not sure about that, because I will argue that in Canada, at least in BC, we are just completing the Site C dam and the Peace. So that's the final dam. And I mentioned in my introduction that there was a two-river policy, that almost all the dams in BC are either on the Peace, which is the northern part of the province, in the Columbia. And the Site C is the last piece of the jigsaw on the Peace. It's like 4 dams on the Peace. Now, I will argue that's the last dam in BC. Like, I don't think there'll be any more dams built in BC, period. We're not in the same development zone. And there's 2 reasons for that. Part of it's because we've run out of effective areas for dam building. What's left are more challenging, more expensive. But more importantly, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous value set has changed. And we're no longer in a cut and thrust development paradigm that we were in 1960. We're in a different paradigm where ecological values, and particularly Indigenous values, are highly influential on decision making. And I can't think of any project in BC at a large scale in terms of changing ecology would be accepted under UNDRA now. I think we're into a different era than we were certainly 6 years ago. I can't speak for the developing countries. You're not there yet, I don't think. But in BC, I think we are.
But the key word is large dams, because we are seeing a growth yet again in small dams, and so it's a more of a descent. So using, as you talked about, a series instead of one big concrete wall, it's a series of small concrete walls spread out. So I'd like to believe that we will become more enlightened, but I'm not seeing it quite yet. This is after discussion.
Yeah, and I was just thinking about also, the increasing concern about ice melting, and increasing climate change. The ice is melting, which is also going to increase the volumes of this already existing river flows, and the dams that are going to put more pressure on these dams, right? Yeah. And I'm going to think about what are the new implications that are going to emerge out of this in terms of even expanding the existing one, maintenance issues throughout the life cycle of this, dam. Though it may not really come in the term of, the instances of development kind of like Ghana or Nepal as we're talking about, but even with the new existing framework, what is going to be the new, development challenges? Maybe if you don't want to talk about it in the context of development, but what might it be for local communities around those communities where we are having, concerns for climate change, increasing volumes of water.
Yeah.
That's really like bring us, new development challenges that may not be in existence as we may have in the system as we're talking about. But even I like the idea you mentioned about how do we develop framework that do not tie us to about 50 years, but even thinking about how do we adapt to the new, emerging challenges that we face that as we are moving forward. We may not have issues about, hunger issues that we may have, in other countries, developing countries, but it may bring us new forms of challenges that may go beyond, those means of development challenges. Even talking about BC's increasing demand for electricity because of new emerging demand for electrical cars and all that. And I think that this is, should bring us a focus to how these trends could bring us new challenges that may not, and they present themselves in a different form, right? But different from how they were before. Yeah.
But see, what I was trying to do, and I do encourage you if you haven't had a chance to see the full film, it's well worth seeing. It's worth an hour.
It is on your reading list, by the way.
Yeah.
No, just saying.
The point I'm trying to make is that I see the Colombia as an exemplar of changing course. In other words, it could apply to the Niger or to the Zambezi or to Congo, or any other major river. The principles that I'm trying to document in the Columbia with modifications could apply to the countries that you folk represent. And all I'm saying is, to my way of thinking, continuing to develop dams for hydropower is a mug's game. It's a dead end, because at some stage the system will break because of climate change and because the cumulative effects become unmanageable. I don't know when that point is, but we were close to it. In fact, I think we exceeded it to some extent in the Columbia. The very fact that you had 20 million fish going up through Canada, now we have zilch, tells you that the system is broken in some form. So I'm trying to get a big picture across in the film, not just a one-off on the Columbia.
For the last part of our session of this afternoon, focused on the transboundary water governance with Jon O'Riordan, and we had a clear understanding, a better understanding of the complexity of the transboundary water governance in the Columbia River Basin. So, Jon, you could pursue your presentation.
So, one of the features of the Columbia River Treaty is that it did have this built-in ability to renew it. I'm not sure about other international river basins where they actually have a review process, but this effectively gives the negotiators a second kick at the cat. So they can, it's very unusual to have a treaty that's created 60 years ago and then punted forward 60 years, and then to apply current values and social value norms and indigenous values into a treaty and transform it. So this is what I'm now going to talk about. And the first thing I want to talk about is that as I say, the trigger for the new treaty was the expiry of the flood control agreement. But that is only a trigger. The reality is that the treaty lost its age over 60 years, became more and more irrelevant to today's values. And so there was a growing need from the communities to think about a new treaty. But what I want to point out is that by the introduction of a third goal, which is ecosystem health, shared with power and flood control, it's a zero-sum game in the Columbia. In other words, you can't get increased ecosystem health without losing on values of flood control or power. There's no win-win. And so what the treaty is trying to do is to balance increased values for ecosystem health and minimize costs to power and flood control. So I'll walk you through. And this, by the way, is a brand new agreement of principle. So I'm dealing with something I've read only in the last week. And the pen is still wet because it's still not ratified. In fact, the full agreement of principles have not been released, only a summary. The first point is that the treaty allowed for, or the treaty agreement of principle to modify the treaty, allowed for Canada to unilaterally reduce storage from 15.5 million acre feet across its 3 reservoirs down to 11.5 over the next 15 years and down to 10.5 in 20 years' time. So that's a major shift in that. What that basically means is it gives the Canadian entities much more flexibility in how they regulate the reservoirs so that they can increase riparian health compared to being forced under the existing treaty to draw down 30 to 40 meters. Now they can keep the reservoirs within a natural range of variation for most years, and only in exceptional years have to go outside either a drought or a flood. So that allows for a much greater development of ecosystem, agriculture, and forestry values on the floodplain from reservoirs than would be the case otherwise. every time for every million acre feet that Canada uses in this agreement, they lose roughly 6% of the Canadian entitlement. So they lose real money. In other words, they don't get $250 to $200 million a year. They get some portion of that. So over the years, they're going to lose millions of dollars in power generated. But the argument is that likely would take place anyway, because if you look at the way power is being generated and going forward, much more of it is being generated through solar and wind than by hydropower. So as time changes, more power will be through distributed systems like solar panels than on large-scale dams and big transmission lines. I haven't done the math, but it's a significant reduction in the Canadian entitlement over the next 10 to 20 years. But on the other side of the coin, the Americans are now required to pay, or will be required to pay, $37.6 billion annually for the use for flood control. Whether they use it or not, they've agreed to pay that much annually, and it's indexed by inflation. So that's a significant amount of money. And on top of that, the values that the flows have for non-flood control, for fish and irrigation and navigation, collectively will be equal to 16.6 billion a year, again indexed for inflation over the next 20 years. So you have a trade-off by losing some money on the Canadian entitlement and gaining some money on flow management. And I believe that it roughly balances itself out, but I haven't seen the full agreement. Now, to make this work, a number of changes have been built into the AIP to help implement it. So the most important of this, and this will get Oliver and Nadal and Phil all worked up, is that the agreement is set for the first time like Canada-US Indigenous-led advisory body on ecosystem health. So you saw from Marilyn's presentation that the agreement on the Elk Valley was really tripartite. It was Canada, US, and the Kanaha First Nation. Well, here we now have a group of First Nations, 3 in Canada and 2 in the States, who are leading an advisory body to look at the whole system, ecological health of the Columbia, not just Canada, but Canada and the US. And what are the cultural, ecological, and spiritual values of nature? And how can they be protected through a one-window approach by this advisory body and brought to the governance table? So to my knowledge, this is a unique system. I don't think there's ever been a single body that's A, looked at ecological health from the headwaters to the estuary, and B, being led by an Indigenous group. So there would be 3 Indigenous Canadians and 3 Indigenous Americans that would lead the thing, that would be supported by a technical team of mixed values, mixed race. And it's got no time frame. It's an ongoing advisory body. It runs for the next 20 years. And it so I can't speak to it in detail because I haven't read the final rule of principle. I've only seen a summary. But I believe that this is a significant shift in governance and a commitment to this third goal of improving ecosystem health. And clearly, in my opinion, but that's only because I've created this film, represents a changing of the course of the Columbia. So the Columbia in 20 years' time will be a different Columbia than it is today as a result of all of this. That's significantly different. So that's number one. Second is that the treaty guarantees for the first time flows for the salmon production throughout the length of the Columbia. Now, mainly in the US, because that's where all the salmon are, but also in the Okanagan system, which is has natural salmon populations in it, because they flow, they enter the Okanagan downstream of the blockage at the Grand Coulee Dam. And in dry years, up to 1.5 million acre feet can be released to protect the salmon flows. Well, that's a big switch. And the Americans have to pay for that, out of that $16 million that we're getting. The third thing is that this Columbia River Salmon Reintroduction Program is now sponsored as part of the treaty. It's no longer an informal arrangement between First Nations. It's now actually a component of the treaty. And it's funded by and supported by the treaty and its infrastructure. So that's given it a major boost as a ongoing sustainable program rather than a volunteer program with limited funds, which it is up to today. So the little conversation we had about what does this mean means that there's sufficient funds now to look at some of the technological changes required in the dams to actually get salmon over the blockage dams in the States into Canada, and then once in Canada, up into the Columbia system. So I would say that that's a 50-year program, not a 5-year program. And it shows a commitment to bringing salmon into the Columbia as a major component of its future. And finally, there's a subset in the Libby Dam. The Libby Dam is, and the Kukinisa Reservoir behind it is the only reservoir that crosses the US-Canadian border. So all the reservoirs are unique to each of the countries. So 3 in Canada, other than Libby, are all in Canada. And all the ones in the States are all in the States. The only one that's actually crosses the border in the state is Libby. And there's been a lot of problems about how to manage the ecosystem values between both sides of the border. So we finally decided to set up a working group in the Kootenay to look at the ways in which the Libby Reservoir can be managed to equalize the values of ecosystem health on both sides of the border. So it's a special team to do that. So and there's millions of dollars changed from the Canadian entitlement, millions of dollars added to flood control and flow, and an advisory body to look at the whole health of this Columbia, which are all new provisions in a new treaty, which substantially change the way in which the old treaty was done. So we no longer have a 1964 treaty, we have a 2024 treaty. And it's quite different in scale and scope. So to me, that's a unique feature that I'm not aware of many cross-border programs in the countries represented by this group here, where there's been that opportunity to recalibrate the agreement. Generally speaking, they're stuck with it, whether they like it or not. And this is a unique opportunity to say, hey, we got it wrong in 64. We can do something better. Now, I want to talk about the UNDRIP and the First Nations, because as mentioned in the introduction, in 1964, we had zero consultation with First Nations. And there was near zero consultation with First Nations when the Grand Coulee Dam was put in 1936 or so. And so the salmon, literally, when you see the film, you'll see oral history where the First Nations spokespeople are saying, we just woke up one day there were no salmon. We had no knowledge there would be no salmon until there were no salmon. No one told us there would be no salmon. It just happened. And we went to our fishing grounds we've done for 100 years, put on our nets, didn't catch anything. And couldn't believe it. So that's the nature of the change to culture. It was basically ripping the heart out of a culture without any redress. And now we've got the DRIPA, which is the act that codifies the Indigenous rights principles. And because of that act, the three principal First Nations in Canada have already negotiated a down payment of 50% of the revenue. So 15% of the revenues created by the Canadian entitlement as of a year ago now flow to the First Nations. That represents roughly 50 to 60 million bucks a year. They got zilch until a year ago. And basically the First Nations said, this is reconciliation in action. We're not settled at 15%. We're saying that's our opening bid. Give us that, give us the money, and we'll work on a final agreement. So I don't think 15% is yet the final, but one of the questions I have for you is to say what would be a reasonable percentage for First Nations, given what they've gone through. The other thing is that the First Nations are formally part of the negotiating team. That was never the case in '64, as I've said. But the AIP was negotiated with the full consent of the three First Nations. Wouldn't have been signed if it hadn't had that full consent. It's a completely different dynamic when they're there. And part of the reasons why it took 5 years to negotiate was because there was essentially a tripartite agreement. There was a Canada, US, Canada, First Nations, US First Nations. It's a much more complicated agreement than back in '64. And remember, this revenue now has changed because the Canadian entitlement is going to go down and the flood control and flow management is going to go up. And so if you've got a vested interest, you think twice about losing revenue. I mean, First Nations are going to have to figure how much do we want on ecosystem health and lose revenue, and how much do we want to gain revenue and lose ecosystem health. So that's to play out in the next few years. I want to talk about climate change and what that means to this agreement, because the part of this new AIP was to embody in the agreement a change in climate. So the first thing you'll notice is that the time frame for the new agreement isn't 60 years like the first one, it's 20 years. And the reason why it's 20 years is because no one knows what the climate's going to be like in the Columbia 60 years from now. So no one's going to commit to some agreement that could be in tatters because of the changing climate. So over the next 60 years, we're probably going to lose all of the glaciers in the Upper Columbia. So that's a significant cooling effect on the water, because right now the thermal temperatures of the Upper Columbia are controlled by melting ice, and will be for the next 20 to 30 years. But the predictions are certainly before the end of the century, there'll be no ice in the Columbia anywhere, and that's going to affect the temperatures. So when you're talking about salmon reintroduction, there's a thermal barrier. Salmon can't survive temperature above 21 to 22 degrees Celsius. The temperature in the American Columbia approaches that now every 2 or 3 years. So flow regime is essential to try and provide cooling flows to maintain a temperature that fish can survive in. But we're losing some of the attributes of fish habitat as a changing climate, plus the fact that in the States, over the next 20, 50 years, the summers are expected to be warmer and drier than they are now. And so the kind of droughts that we're seeing in California are going to flow into Washington State and Oregon. Secondly, most of the precipitation is going to fall as rain, not snow. So up till now, the snowpack has been like a battery. It freezes the rain, it stores frozen water in the watershed as a battery, and it releases that water over the summer and discharges the battery. 20 years from now, there'll be no battery. The water will come down as rain, flow through the system and go out. And so it's instantaneous. There's no accumulation of storage that can be reused later, unless we create artificial batteries under new solar power, which is probably what's going to happen. So there will be a battery, but it's a man-made battery, not a solar battery, not a glacial battery. I mentioned the loss of glaciers, and I mentioned the increasing temperature regime in the Columbia. So the key to this is what's called adaptive management. And the idea of adaptive management is that you don't forecast precisely what's going to happen. You forecast scenarios of what might happen. And so there's now a model that models the entire flows of the Columbia, from the headwaters of the Columbia to the estuary, and looks at every reservoir, every tributary, and calculates how much water will come in and be stored and released under a whole range of conditions, from severe drought to severe floods, so that the modelers can develop an operational plan that mimics that range. But it's not one forecast, because in any one year, it could be anywhere in a range of 0 to 100. So you can't forecast it in 2044, it will be X. All you know is in 2044, it will be somewhere between X minus 10 and X plus 10. And 2064, it will be anything between X minus 30 and X plus 30. In other words, the range of variation will be greater and greater. And so adaptive management is where you monitor key indicators like flows, temperature, riparian zone, estuary health, fish production. And you track that in real time. And as the climate changes and these monitoring change from what you expect, you adapt. You release less water, you release more water, until you get the balance right again. So it's a continuing adaptive process over 20 years. But the management of the Columbia is going to significantly change as a result of that. But at the same time, so is the economic and social health of the valley. The energy supply will be totally different in 2060 than it is today. It will largely be a distributed system on rooftops and not big dams, power lines, and storage, battery storage by snow. It'll be people sharing power on rooftops in a community. So the whole nature of the economic and social fabric of the Columbia will change, and the Columbia Treaty has to change with it. So there's no way that you could have a treaty that would last more than 20 years. But it's going to have to be massively adapted as this program plays out. So what happens is that the utilities produce an operating plan, and they run from each year starting on August 1st. So this August, in 2 weeks' time, a week's time, there'll be an operating plan for the next 5 years. That's based on the existing treaty, and over the ratification process, which we'll talk about, which will take about a year, it will be modified to gradually build in the AIP. But that'll take time to build in. That's a major piece of work. And every time you change the operating plan in year one, you change it in years 2, 3, and 4 because you start from a different base each year. So it's going to take, I would say, till 2030 before the new 5-year operating plan fully includes all of the provisions of the approval principle. And as I mentioned before, adaptive management will track these changes, and I would believe that a new negotiation will take place between sometime in the 30s and early 40s to deal with what's going to happen after 2044. So it's again, I'm not. You the students who are here on this seminar need to be aware. It's just all of us are facing climate change. It's not one river basin that's not facing climate change. Is anyone else aware of anything that's been done to start to drive the changes that might happen in climate to the management regime of international river basins? I'm not sure. I can't tell you. I don't know what it's like in some of these other areas. All I know is in the Columbia, it's real, and that's what they're doing. But whether that's happening in the Mekong or the Nile, no idea. I'll let you guys, if you've said it, anybody knows it, I'd like to hear about it.